Michigan wide receiver Roman Wilson is the next Chris Olave, just without the first round draft capital. All that and more in this episode of the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast.
You are Locked On Dynasty Football, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Here are your hosts, Marcus Mosher and Kate Madjuk.
Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. I am your host, Marcus Mosher. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosher. Joining me today, as always, is Kate Madjuk. You can follow her on Twitter at Kate Madjuk. You can also read her at Pro Football Focus and Behind the Steel Curtain. On today's show, we are taking a look at wide receiver Roman Wilson from the national champion Michigan Wolverines. And I got to say, Kate, this was somebody who came on my radar a little bit later. I know they won the national championship, but in terms of a dynasty asset, it seems like he's continued to rise throughout the pre-draft process. What did you see when you turned on the film?
I think there are a lot of things to like about Roman Wilson. He's a fourth-year player coming out of Michigan, a little bit on the smaller side, 5'10 and 3/4 inches, 185 pounds. He's 22. He's going to turn 23 in June. So a little bit older than some of the other prospects that we've talked about, like Keon Coleman, bright, crisp at the age of 20. But despite that size, Marcus, you look at Roman Wilson, who, again, kind of a late breakout, never had a season of more than 800 receiving yards, did have 12 touchdowns this year with the Michigan Wolverines. But despite that size and despite that lack of like a monstrous breakout, you're looking at a guy that I think is a true threat at all three levels of the field. He's not just a short guy. He's not just a gadget guy. He's a true deep threat. He's got a ton of speed. He's so smooth. Roman Wilson might be just one of my favorite guys that I'm going to project is going in round 2 here in the NFL draft. You said at the top of the show, he reminds you a lot of Chris Olave without the draft capital, but I don't think Roman Wilson's going to be that far behind him.
Well, so what Olave went, was it 11 or 12 in that 2022 draft? I think it's pretty safe to say that Roman Wilson's going to be a second round pick. Maybe he slides like to the back or to the front end or the third round just because this wide receiver class is so deep and it's so good. But this is a top 60 player all day long. Like the tape is really, really good. He makes plays down the field, but he's not just a vertical threat. Okay. Like he'll actually run routes. You can run your offense through him. You don't have to change things up too much. He'll run the comebacks. He'll run the outs. He'll run the slants. It's just not very often that we see these type of players come to the NFL where you've got 4.3 speed and you're a good route runner. Like it's a pretty rare combination. And typically that translates very well to the NFL. And I think like the very high end comparison for him is Chris Olave, right? Like that's the guy that can be your number one receiver in an offense that you can run everything through. But even if it's the lower end and it's, let's say it's Nelson Aguilar, still a very valuable NFL player. So I really like the tape. I think one of the things that I really appreciated about his game is he is so doggone tough. And for somebody who is under 6 foot, under 190 pounds, I just really appreciated how many times he got hit hard, popped right back up, and was ready to block his tail off on the next play.
Absolute competitor. And I think that's like one of his biggest strengths. You mentioned the smooth route running. You mentioned the 4.3 speed. Like this guy, he can just get down the field and he can do so smoothly. Like you said, it's not just straight line speed necessarily. Like he's a smooth enough route runner that his speed translates there. Top end competitor. He's fierce. I feel like he kind of embodies Michigan football, the ground and pound, like, and that is a big reason why I think we never really saw a true breakout for Roman Wilson. For some of the scout or the stat box score watchers, like Roman Wilson isn't going to pop off the page, but when you look at the way that Michigan offense was structured, it was built very much around the run. wasn't one of these pass heavy offenses. So I think, the fact that we saw Roman Wilson come out and post a 12 touchdown season in spite of that, you've got to be really excited.
Yeah, and I also mentioned he went to the Senior Bowl and he was one of the best receivers at the Senior Bowl. Now, I don't want to overreact too much, but it makes me feel good that he went against the top cornerbacks in the nation and looked really good. He even went against Quinyon Mitchell on one rep, had a little in-breaking route, beat him. Just feel very comfortable with his overall game. I think he is a very, very solid player. Now, he's not perfect. Let's talk about some of the weaknesses. I do think he tends to play at one speed, which is fast, which is good. But I'd like to see him vary his speeds a little bit to try to create a little bit more separation. Like Chris Olave, okay, not overly dynamic after the catch. And it's one of the things that's a little frustrating because he's so fast. I wish he was just better at making plays once he has the ball in his hands. I think that's what separates him from like somebody like Tank Dell last year, who was a vertical receiver, who actually ran in the 4.4s, but it was so much better after the catch, making guys miss, breaking arm tackles. And that's the other thing with Roman Wilson. I just wish he played a little bit stronger. You can see at times when cornerbacks want to press him, they can get into his chest, they can bully him around a little bit. He needs to improve his overall play strength. He's not the most physical receiver. He's not going to win a bunch of contested catches. So what I think he probably translates or projects as a Z receiver in the NFL. But that's okay. I think he's somebody that you want to keep away from press coverage and you want to give him free releases because when you do, he can fly.
Yeah, and you mentioned sort of the one speed. Obviously, you do like to see wide receivers, especially at the next level, that are going to vary up their speeds because that does help generate separation. But I do think what's good with Roman Wilson is that we haven't seen separation, despite the fact that he's got this sort of one speed. We haven't necessarily seen that impact his ability to separate. He's a very good separator. And I will say, if you're going to have one speed, make it a fast one.
Yeah.
And that is something that Roman Wilson has excelled in. Now, I think all things considered, looking at Roman Wilson, you might be discouraged by the size and you might be discouraged maybe by the lack of sort of takeover statistically. But I do think all things considered, Roman Wilson is a very clean prospect. I think he's going to be a very quarterback friendly wide receiver. He's got pretty sure hands. That ability to be used at every level of the field, I think, is going to be a plus for him. He can play out of the slot. He could play the Z receiver. I think there's a lot of diversity to his game, including the speed element that is going to make him a relatively safe prospect when it comes to his NFL production.
So we're going to get into some of the advanced numbers and some of the analytics here on Rowan Wilson, but just in general for his production, this Michigan offense just didn't throw the ball very many times. There were 7 times last year where JJ McCarthy attempted 20 or fewer passes. And then when they got into some of these big games, like the Penn State game, I think JJ McCarthy had 9 total attempts. It's really hard to be productive if your offense is only throwing the ball 9 times. I'll also just point back to the last few years under Jim Harbaugh. None of the receivers have really even had production. Even somebody like Nico Collins, who was 6'4" and ran in the 4.4s, his best season at Michigan was 700 yards. Roman Wilson did the same thing. He had the double-digit touchdown season. So it's just one of these things that Michigan has, at least under Harbaugh, never been a wide-open passing attack. So it's really hard to compare his numbers to like Troy Franklin, who played in this wide-open offense out in the Pac-12. So the overall counting stats just don't bother me here.
Yeah, and I do that. I think that's probably one of the biggest takeaways that I want to give here with Roman Wilson is that there are, several players that I don't think the box score tells you the full story about this player, but I think probably out of everybody that I've scouted so far in this draft class, Roman Wilson is one that, like, the underwhelming box score is so different than the story you see on the tape.
Yes. All right, let's talk about some of the advanced numbers because I want to look at his breakout age, dominant rating, and some of the stable metrics from PFF because I think you might be quite surprised on how he does in those. We will get to that next. This episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. What's the first thing that you would do if you had an extra hour in your day? Would you go for a run? Would you take a nap? How about read a book? A lot of us spend our lives wishing that we had more time. The question is, time for what? If time was unlimited, how would you use it? The best way to squeeze that special thing into your schedule is to know what's important to you and make it a priority. Therapy can help you find what matters to you so that you can go and do more of it. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's done entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists anytime for any reason at no additional charge. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Just visit betterhelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That is BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Are you having to turn down the volume because of all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all that screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or on the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, Kate, let's dive into the numbers. What do we got?
I think people are going to be pretty pleasantly surprised here by Roman Wilson. Now, overall, like we said, the Michigan offense not necessarily one that you're going to get a ton of true production out of compared to some of the other players that you're looking at in this draft class, but actually posted a 40% dominator rating, which ranked in the 82nd percentile for wide receivers. That means he accounted for 40% of combined percentage of his team's total receiving yards, total receiving touchdowns. You're going to love that all day because though the total number is not one that is overwhelming, it does account for a high percentage of the passing production that actually took place here for the Michigan Wolverines. Now, you look at some of his other advanced metrics, target share, you look at breakout age, a little bit less overwhelming, 44th percentile and 13th percentile, respectively, breakout age of 22.2. But again, a little bit less concern for that with Roman Wilson, just considering the structure of the offense.
Yeah, you'd like to see that breakout age be a little bit younger, but this is also just an older class. We have to remember the COVID year in 2020 messed a lot of these things up. So, and I think some of these receivers would have came out last year, but because they had the extra year of eligibility, they decided to go back to school. Okay, let's look at the stabled numbers. All right, Roman Wilson, 98th percentile receiving grade, 90th percentile separation percentage. And this is the big one for me, Kate. 80th percentile in yards per route run when he was actually running a route in this Michigan offense that he really had to do. He was pretty productive, and he was productive because of the two ones that are ahead of him. He was so good at creating separation. Now, one of the concerns is it's twofold here, right? The contested catch percentage, 28th percentile, yards after the catch, 27th percentile. Those are just two parts of his game that probably are never going to be average just because he's under 6 foot. He's under 190 pounds. He just doesn't have a lot of strength to his game, but that's okay because those are the same weaknesses that somebody like a Chris Olave has or a Tyler Lockett has, but they've been able to become very good NFL receivers, despite really never being a contested catch receiver. So overall for me, this profile, at least from PFF, is very, very solid. It makes me feel really encouraged about Roman Wilson moving forward.
Yeah, I think generally speaking, a lot of maybe the advanced metrics kind of, I think probably better contextualize the game than the overall box score. And something else, had some drop concerns early on in his career, but over the last couple of seasons, really, really cleaned that up. Just 5 total drops over the past 3 seasons combined. Had a single drop in the 2023 season. Just a really reliable guy when he's asked to execute. And like you mentioned, yards per route run, I think, is an especially important stat for him just because of the fact that he was asked to do, some blocking and not necessarily run routes for the sake of receiving routes. He was involved a lot in that blocking scheme given the run heavy nature of this offense. So yards per route run, probably a lot more meaningful even for Roman Wilson than a lot of other wide receivers. And this is a stat that we know is a very sticky one when it comes to uh, projecting production moving forward.
I will say one of my fears about Roman Wilson is as a rookie and as a young player, how involved is he going to be in your offense? Because if he's not super dynamic after the catch, you're probably just not giving him very many of the layup throws, right? You're not throwing him tunnel screens. You're not giving him touches behind the backfield. You're not giving him little 3-yard slants where you can get the ball on the move. I think a lot of his production is going to have to come from running a deep dig route or running a comeback route or running an out route. And he's going to have to be able to separate and create against really good cornerbacks on the outside. I have no doubts that he's going to be able to do that. I just worry about him in his production right away because you're just not going to have those easy passes and the easy layups to kind of build up your floor.
Yeah, I think that's very fair in terms of just that overall, notion of I want to get the ball in his hands. So
Yeah,
he
he's
can
not
just
that type of
he's
receiver.
not going to be that guy. So you're not going to have so many specifically generated touches, which is why it might take a little bit more time for him to earn a target share with his respective NFL team. But all things considered, maybe he's not going to be a year one breakout for fantasy football, but from a dynasty perspective, I think Wilson's profile generally feels like a pretty safe one to me.
I agree. I just wanted to compare it to like Xavier Worthy, who we did a couple shows ago, who also is a speed receiver. I actually think Roman Wilson is the more polished vertical threat, but Xavier Worthy is just so much better after the catch. So I do think he's going to get a lot of those screens and backfield touches. That's just going to boost his floor a little bit. I think it's going to be much harder for Roman Wilson to be productive right away than Xavier Worthy. However, doesn't mean that Roman Wilson doesn't have dynasty value. Let's talk about where he's being drafted and where he's being ranked among other dynasty receivers and our favorite player comps for him next. This episode is brought to you by Gametime. Listen, I absolutely love Gametime. It's the only ticketing app that I use when I go to games. And now Gametime is now the authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets even faster and easier. Prices on the Gametime app actually go down the closer it gets to the first pitch, with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee. Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets. I can't wait to use Gametime this year for my Pirates, who are actually looking pretty decent to start the year. You can get last minute deals. Save up to 60% off buying last minutes for sports, concert, comedy, and theater events near you. Plus, you can save even more with exclusive in-app deals on select seats ahead of the game or the event. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. We are discussing the dynasty value of Michigan wide receiver Roman Wilson. Kate, where is he being drafted among incoming rookie receivers?
He's actually being drafted kind of bottom of the barrel here in terms of these wide receivers that we've talked about so far. Currently coming in wide receiver 10, just beyond some names that we have actually talked about here quite recently. Keon Coleman, A.D. Mitchell. So definitely in this sort of second or third tier wide receiver for this incoming rookie class. Now, in terms of his overall value, Marcus, right now being drafted on average wide receiver 59 in dynasty startup drafts. Obviously, that's without a landing spot. And Roman Wilson, probably one of these guys that, unlike some of these other players, I don't see landing spot being a huge impact on his immediate dynasty value, because I think the floor is pretty safe, right? So I'm looking at the value at wide receiver 69. I'm kind of feeling good about where he is being drafted overall.
I struggle with this one because I feel I think his landing spot's going to matter a lot because I do think you're going to want him with a quarterback that can get him the ball accurately, that can throw the ball down the field, that can throw on timing. And I would like him to be in a pass heavier offense that can give him the quality targets that he deserves. Because here's my fear. I know like Pittsburgh, use them for an example. They're really looking at Roman Wilson and maybe like round 2. I think that's a dreadful fit. I mean, it's a good fit for Roman Wilson's play style with like George Pickens. I don't love it with Justin Fields, and I don't love it with Arthur Smith, and I certainly don't love it with Russell Wilson. But I do think there's other situations where, like, I just think he's a better player than Jameson Williams, and if he went to Detroit, I think that's a wonderful fit for him. I think if the Kansas City Chiefs wanted to draft him to be one of their outside receivers, I think that's awesome. I think it's a great fit. I am a little bit worried about the fit here in terms of his dynasty value.
Here's the thing, Marcus. For the wide receiver position, I generally am going to lean talent and prospect over situation, because obviously we have seen just how quickly situations can change. We've
It's
seen
true.
more big time trades than we've ever seen in the NFL here over the past few seasons. Teams aren't necessarily keeping their superstars. And obviously those superstars have a giant impact on the future of dynasty players in general, which is why I think when you're building your dynasty roster, and I like to build mine around wide receiver talent, I'm generally going to lean on prospects. And generally speaking, when I'm just grading out these wide receivers, I think Roman Wilson for me is closer to wide receiver 5 than wide receiver 10. And that comes from really liking the prospect, really liking the diverse nature of his game, liking the speed, liking the hands. There's not a lot that I don't like about Roman Wilson besides maybe his size. And this is an age in the NFL that I think we're seeing is more adaptable to size than ever.
So I just wanted to mention some comps really quickly. It's something we love to do at the end of the show. I compared him at the top to Chris Olave, who I got his rookie card right here. I'm a big Chris Olave fan. I've been a big Chris Olave fan for a long time.
You're not a big Chris Olave fan for Dynasty, though.
And that's
So
the
that's
point, right?
probably the point here for you.
That's the point. Is like I think Chris Olave is an awesome NFL receiver who has first round draft capital, who the Saints traded a bunch to go up and get. But the ceiling's a little bit limited when you're that small and you're kind of viewed as just a deep threat route runner type. So I have no doubts that he could be a 900-yard receiver like by year 2 and maybe a 1,100-yard receiver by year 2. But I do wonder what's the ceiling here unless he gets into an offense with a really good quarterback and he becomes the focal point. So I think for me, I think wide receiver 8, wide receiver 9 is probably about right until we figured out the landing spot. And once we do, I think we'll have a better idea of what his ceiling can be in the NFL.
I think that's very fair. And I don't think you're going to be drafting Roman Wilson to be a core piece of your
No.
offense here from the jump. And that's why I'm going to be willing to be a little bit patient. Now, would I be surprised if Roman Wilson ends up being one of these second year players that I buy after a relatively quiet rookie season? No. So maybe you can stand pat, but I'm a huge believer in the talent, a huge believer in the prospect that's going to rise to the top versus landing spot, which again, in today's NFL, Marcus, we don't know what we're going to be waking up to in the morning. But I think what we're going to wake up to is Roman Wilson still being that dog.
Can I give you a prediction on where I think he lands?
Yes, please.
I think he's going to go to the Ravens at like pick 62. The Ravens need more receiver help. They could use some more
Marcus.
speed. The
Oh,
Harbaugh connection is there. I actually think he fits that offense pretty well. That's my prediction. I think he lands with the Ravens.
I think from, this is from my purely outside perspective. I think they need a little bit more size in that offense, and obviously Roman Wilson doesn't fit that build. Um, but he's again one of these really good players that I think, generally speaking, he's going to be a huge asset to any team. It's just a matter of maybe like I don't think I think he's going to be able to contribute equally to whatever team he plays for, and they can find a role for him. It's just about whether or not that role will be immediately conducive for fantasy production. Maybe not, but I think he's a guy that is going to earn targets sooner
I
rather
agree.
than later.
Because he's a good football player. Like, bottom
He's a
line,
good football player.
Roman Wilson is a good football player who runs routes with good speed and he gets open. He's a good football player.
Check all of the boxes.
Yes.
Roman Wilson, baby.
We're just waiting to see what kind of situation he lands in to show us what his fantasy ceiling could be. Right now, wide receiver 8, wide receiver 9 feels about right. That is it for today's show. We want to thank you for making Locked On Dynasty Football your first listen every single day. Go check out the channel on YouTube. We are free and available on all platforms. On tomorrow's show, it's a Wednesday, so that means Matt Williamson will be joining us. Go follow Kate on Twitter at Kate Majuk. You can follow me at Marcus_Mosher, and we will see you right back here tomorrow.